This lecture is focused on practicing genre analysis, so the kind of work that you need to be able to do with a text in order to succeed in both the genre unit of intermediate composition, but also in many ways the final project as well. Um, this is designed to be a little interactive. This is typically an activity that I would do with you all in person in class. Um, because if you're watching this, you're probably my online student. This is just designed to replicate that as best we can. I encourage you to get some scrap paper handy so that you can be actively involved, which is going to help you learn the most from and benefit the most from this lecture. So when we're talking about analyzing a text to look at its genre and the conventions of that genre and why that's significant, we're kind of talking about what's roughly a two-step process. The first step is to identify the conventions of that genre, so the patterns that make it recognizable as a genre. The second step is then to do something with those patterns and say, why is this interesting or useful? So for that first step, identifying conventions, there's a couple basic tools and strategies that you can make use of. The first that's most important is to gather samples to study. It's very difficult to do this, to get the specifics that you need and to get as thorough an investigation and examination of these texts that as you possibly can. It's difficult to do all of that without having samples at hand to look at. The next thing you can think about doing is analyzing the context of the genres that you've gathered, those samples. What's the rhetorical situation behind the samples you've looked at? And if you recall, when we've learned about the rhetorical situation, that involved understanding the entire situation around which rhetoric is made through that text, right? So who's the author? Who's the audience that was intended or invoked? What was the purpose that author originally created the text for? What purpose do those users come to the text with? What kind of time and place is this text? Are these texts typically found in? What kind of text are they? We can also, even a little bit more basically beyond, or I should say in addition to the rhetorical situation, also think about basic reporter questions, right? How, when, and where are these texts typically used and by whom? Who creates them? Who regulates them? These are all useful questions for gathering the situation and the context around these genres. Last, I have a tool for you that I preview on the next slide, but it's available on Blackboard, developed by a writing researcher named Anne Beaufort, and she calls it a genre matrix. And I've modified hers a little bit. Basically, the matrix is a chart that helps you to break down a genre by 4 different categories: rhetorical issues, typical content, structure, and style and language. So you can kind of see a really small preview of it here. Again, there's a Word doc version actually is what I've provided for you on Blackboard, so that if you'd like, you can go ahead and type right into the document, or you can print it out. It's designed to be, useful and used, but you can see that rhetorical considerations include things like who's the intended audience, what do readers already know, what do they want to know, how much time will the audience spend with the document, what's the purpose, and those are just some starting questions. I'm sure you could think of more. What kind of typical content would you expect to find? Is there certain kinds of information that's appropriate to find in this genre? What kinds of evidence are acceptable to support an argument? The structure, you can think about that. Structure and style and language, the last 2 categories, really could be thought about in a couple of different ways. So we talk about how texts, for instance, let's think of like a written document, we talk about how those are organized very often, but we can also think about how those are visually organized, right? Or we can also apply these considerations to a visual text, a video, an image. If I asked you to break down some of the conventions of a movie poster, for instance, you could tell me a bit about how that's usually structured or usually laid out. We typically expect to see like fine print details about the film, being complete list of the major stars and the director and the producers and the movie studio and stuff in very fine white light print at the bottom, right? That wouldn't usually be in the center of the poster. The center of the poster is usually some kind of provocative image. Sometimes it's like, you know, a shot of like action in motion from the film, or sometimes it's more of like a portrait of the main characters. And we can even, if we break that down into subgenres, movie posters for different kinds of movies, different genres of movies, then we can even get more specific about patterns we see there. So I use this example just to show how we can think about structure not only in terms of like a sequence that we talk about with a written text, but also how things are visually structured as well. Style and language, again, we can think about the style of written text, but we can also talk about visual style as well. What kind of font faces are used? What kinds of colors are used? That kind of thing. So download that and keep that handy. That's going to be useful actually for the rest of the video. So if you want, go ahead and pause and download that and take a look. So what we're going to do is we're going to do two kinds of practice together. And the practice involves looking at not really actual examples of the genre, but to kind of make it more fun, instead of just looking at an example and comparing what we come up with to the example, I'm going to have you compare what we come up with to a satire of the example. I do that because I think it's more entertaining, A. And I also do that because what a satire does is they try to appropriate that genre by over-exaggerating the conventions we'd expect, right? So, like, if you've ever watched The Daily Show, for instance, they over-exaggerate what you would expect to find on a news show, right? Like, sometimes they break into breaking news with a field reporter, and they have them do something that kind of seems silly, but what they're doing is exaggerating what a real field reporter might do, right? So, what I want you to do is after I kind of overview this, I want you to pause the video lecture, and I really mean that. Actually hit pause, and I want you to take those matrix categories from that handout I pointed you to and map out what conventions you might expect for a cable breaking news broadcast. So, you know, you're watching CNN, MSNBC, Fox, whatever, you're watching a cable news channel, and they break into whatever regularly scheduled programming they have to bring you breaking news on something happening that minute. What do you expect in terms of the rhetorical kinds of considerations of what does that look like rhetorically? What kind of content do you see in breaking news? How is it structured? What is its style and language? So go ahead and pause, and then once you're done, I have a link down at the bottom for you to click on to open up a piece from The Onion that satirizes breaking news. So now that you've watched that Onion example, go ahead and compare that to both your chart of conventions you identified. I'm sure you saw some of the conventions you could think of in that video, as well as I have here, usually in class, I would generate a list based on what you all came up with. Since we can't do that here, I came up with a chart of my own, but I'm sure you found some things that I missed. So when I think of a breaking news broadcast, I think of things stylistically like urgent language, this breaking report, happening now, live on the scene. I think of really sleek visuals and fonts, like everything on the set is reflective. I think of broadcasters delivering the script with fairly even tone, but then they like raise their tone of voice to indicate emotions like surprise. But typically they sound very like professional and a little bit distanced, right? They usually don't sound too emotional unless what's happening is really extreme. You know, I think examples are like when breaking news is something horrific, like, you know, the September 11th, you know, attacks. Stuff like that is really only when the only times you see a broadcaster kind of break from that kind of tone. In terms of structure, I usually think of expecting to see it start. I think of sequencing like it starts at the desk with the anchor. They give us the most important information, then they'll probably cut to a field reporter, then they'll come back to the desk, maybe there'll be a little bit of back and forth, then they'll move maybe to some interviews or some pre-tape segments that give us a little bit of background. Content-wise, I think of live footage, like maybe it's from a helicopter up above or from a reporter at the scene. They show like emergency vehicles or workers or There's interviews with eyewitnesses and experts. Rhetorically, right? Everything is geared towards the audience's desire to know things quickly and to see what happened and to see what happened visually as much as possible. So even when there's nothing visual to show, like maybe the news is about a law that's just been passed, or the Supreme Court has made a decision, they'll have people standing outside the building, even though that doesn't really lend any new information about what's happened. It still satisfied that desire to know, right? That desire to know what things look like and see them happening shapes what that looks like, right? It's the breaking news broadcasts are also shaped by news organizations wanting ratings. They want people to keep watching, so they try to keep making you believe they're going to bring in new information, even if they're really just cycling through the same information for like half an hour or more. It's meant to inform, but it's also kind of meant to entertain, to keep people watching. So that's my kind of list, and I'm sure that you could see again this list and also much of your own list reflected in what we saw in that satirical breaking news broadcast, right? Reflected in the choices that they made in putting that together. They exaggerated a lot of what we came up with here on our list. I didn't come up with a list here, but I can kind of quickly talk through some stuff. I think we can try this again. If you think about movie trailers, and specifically we'll go to the subgenre of Oscar bait movie trailers. So if that doesn't bring up a definition in mind quickly, you can think of stuff like Forrest Gump or The Shawshank Redemption. Not to say these movies are bad, many of these movies are very good, but they're usually movies where the decisions, in making them are very much geared towards winning awards. So we're thinking about the trailers for those movies, and again, we're going to look at a satire that again is not an example of the genre, but is useful because it exaggerates the conventions of the genre. So go ahead and pause, come up with your list, and then click on the link for this satirical trailer. So hopefully your list came up with things like particular kinds of scenes, hopeful moments, emotional kinds of things, the kind of music you might hear, the kinds of camera shots you might see, the kind of plot outline that you might kind of see used, stuff like that gets reflected in that example trailer. So what we've done with these first two, right, with the Oscar bait movie trailers and then also with the breaking news, was we practiced identifying conventions, and then we looked at those satirical examples to see them in action. You can do this with your own genres, identify conventions, and then look to examples among what you've gathered to kind of confirm, yes, this is there. But that's only the first step. What you also want to do then to follow up when you're writing your draft, and maybe this is something that you have to kind of start writing in order to do. So keep in mind that some of this you might have to be in the process of writing to do it, right? And that's why revision is so important, is sometimes you have to just get that beginning stuff down on the page and then build on it, look back on it, say, what else can I pull out of this? What else can I say? But so the next step is to say, what do these conventions show? What's useful or interesting here? And so, a couple of questions you might ask are here in the second bullet point. What do they show about who those users are, about who those creators are? What kinds of things do they value? We can see what kinds of things, for instance, if we think about movie trailers for Oscar bait movies, those really clearly show values of the audience and the creators in terms of, characters changing and developing and growing, seeing people make the most of a bad situation, seeing people, have good morals or overcome things, right? Those are certain things that are kind of valued, right? That and it even shows kind of their orientation towards movies and what movies should be. Movies should be about inspiring people or moving people or informing people in some way, right? Looking at those trailers allows us to start making those evidence-based assumptions about who the creators are, who the audience is, and what they think, what they believe. So that third bullet point, right, looks at, we can also use these implications to talk about how genres organize relationships, how they shape knowledge. So how they shape our understanding of issues, right, is obviously a really key consideration when we talk about the media, in terms of what gets covered, what doesn't, how that shapes perceptions and values and attitudes and knowledge of the recipients of that news. But you could go deeper as well, and this is a little difficult for me to do off the cuff without an example. But all kinds of texts shape what we know about something, and also by what they leave out, kind of shape what we know as well. And so one of my tips for you is to think about not only what's there once you've compiled your list of conventions, but also to kind of look at it and think about what's missing. Because that contrast, building in contrasts, is always a great approach to research, and it helps us to and analysis, and helps us to think about why what's there is significant. Because without that contrast, you might think, well, okay, here's my list. I don't know what this means. But when you think about what's missing, then you think about how, oh, I see now how this is shaped in a way that I didn't realize before. And partially because, you may be picking a genre that you're really familiar with and used to, and in a way that's harder to analyze because it's more difficult to see it for what it is. And that brings me to my second tip, which is you want to do your best to see your genre as strange, to notice everything and take nothing for granted. If you were from another culture, or, an extraterrestrial being from Mars, and you came upon this genre, what would you notice looking at it? A lot more than you yourself might notice, right? So again, this is kind of a procedure for you to follow for thinking about what the genres look like that you will be analyzing in the rationale. So the reason that we're talking about analysis and not just creation, right, is that it's important to do this analytic work for your genre recast so that you know what kind of conventions to appropriate in the creative portion of that recast, right? I've asked you to take a text that you've already written, your literacy analysis or another text, and then to refashion it into something else. So you'll need to identify the conventions of the genre you're refashioning it into in order to do that successfully. And then in the rationale where you explain the choices you made, in order to tell me why you added this kind of content or deleted this kind of content or made it look different or made what was a paper into a video or whatever other choices you make, you need to be able to justify that based on an analysis of the conventions of that genre.